The 20th century was built on ideas people were willing to die for: capitalism, socialism, democracy, revolution. Entire nations rose, fought, and collapsed under the weight of these beliefs. But the 21st century did something colder. It did not defeat ideology with another ideology. It replaced belief with efficiency and turned human society into a system that only asks one question: does it work? For most of the last century, the world was understood through a simple lens. There were competing ideologies, and each one claimed to offer the ultimate blueprint for how society should function. People didn't just support these systems, they identified with them. Political beliefs were not preferences, they were identities. Entire generations were shaped by the idea that choosing the right system meant choosing the right future. That belief made sense in its time. When information was limited and the world was divided into clear blocks, ideology acted as a map. It simplified complexity. It gave people a sense of direction, even if that direction came with conflict. Wars were not just about territory or resources. They were framed as battles between visions of how humanity should organize itself. But something began to change. Not all at once, and not through a single event. It happened gradually, through a series of failures that exposed the limits of these systems. The collapse of centrally planned economies revealed what happens when human incentives are suppressed. Financial crises exposed what happens when markets are left completely unchecked. And as these contradictions accumulated, the clarity that ideology once provided started to fade. What replaced it was not another grand idea, but something far more practical and far more unsettling. Most people think the world became less ideological because we matured, learned from history, and moved toward more balanced systems. But that's not what actually happened. The real issue is not that ideology disappeared. It's that it stopped being the driving force behind decisions. What replaced it is something far more subtle: optimization. Today, nations, institutions, and even individuals are no longer primarily guided by what they believe is right. They are guided by what produces results. Policies are evaluated not by their philosophical consistency, but by their measurable outcomes. Systems are not judged by their ideals, but by their efficiency. This shift changes everything, because when belief is replaced by optimization, the question is no longer what should we stand for. It becomes what works best under pressure. And once that question takes over, the structure of society begins to transform in ways most people don't fully see but experience every single day. This is mind-over system, where we break down the systems and ideas that shape how you think, how you decide, and how the world around you actually operates. To understand what replaced ideology, you have to look at what actually survived it. Because when both sides of a system collapse in different ways, what remains is not a winner. It's a lesson. And that lesson reshapes everything that comes after. There are 4 hidden layers behind this shift. The first layer is the collapse of pure ideologies. In theory, both capitalism and centrally planned systems were built on coherent logic. One trusted individual freedom and market forces to allocate resources efficiently. The other believed coordination and equality could produce a more stable and fair outcome. On paper, both made sense. In reality, both expose something deeper about human behavior. Unrestricted markets did not simply create innovation and growth. They also amplified risk, rewarded short-term gain, and allowed complex financial systems to detach from real value. When crisis happened, they revealed how fragile that structure could become when driven by unchecked incentives. At the same time, systems that attempted to suppress individual motivation in favor of collective planning faced a different kind of breakdown. When people no longer saw a clear connection between effort and reward, the system lost its internal energy. Productivity slowed, innovation stalled, and over time, the structure became rigid instead of adaptive. What matters here is not which system was worse. It's what they both revealed. Neither extreme could fully account for how humans actually behave. And once that became clear, something fundamental shifted. The goal was no longer to defend a perfect system. It became to build something that could function despite imperfection. That leads to the second layer, the rise of hybrid systems. Instead of choosing sides, countries began to combine elements that worked and discard what didn't. Market mechanisms were introduced into previously rigid structures. Social protections were layered onto market-driven economies. Policies became less about ideological purity and more about practical outcomes. This is why you can see systems that appear contradictory on the surface but stable in practice. High taxation alongside strong economic performance, state coordination alongside private enterprise. What matters is not consistency with a theory, but consistency in results. Over time, this approach spread, not because it was philosophically elegant, but because it was effective. The third layer goes even deeper. The shift of power from ideology to infrastructure. In the past, power was often defined by belief systems and political alignment. Today, it is increasingly defined by control over systems that enable modern life. Supply chains, financial networks, data infrastructure, and technological ecosystems have become the real foundation of influence. What determines stability is no longer just political structure. It is the ability to maintain these systems under pressure. A country can have a strong ideology and still struggle if it cannot secure energy, technology, or access to global markets. At the same time, nations that can manage these flows effectively gain leverage that goes beyond traditional definitions of power. This creates a different kind of dependency, not based on belief, but on function. And once systems become interconnected at this level, separation becomes costly. Every component depends on another. Every disruption has ripple effects. Which brings us to the fourth layer, the human consequence. As systems become more optimized, they also become more impersonal. Decisions are made based on efficiency, scalability, and performance metrics. These are necessary for large-scale coordination, but they do not always align with how individuals experience their lives. When outcomes are optimized at a system level, they can still feel unstable at a personal level. People begin to notice a gap between growth and security, between productivity and meaning, between participation and control. And when that gap widens, it creates pressure. Not just economically, but psychologically. This is where you start to see reactions that don't fit neatly into traditional frameworks. Movements that focus less on detailed policy and more on identity, belonging, or frustration. Behavioral shifts where individuals disengage, not because they reject the system entirely, but because they no longer feel connected to its outcomes. The system becomes more efficient, but also harder to relate to. And that tension is not a side effect. It is a structural result of how the system now operates. You can see this shift not in theory, but in everyday patterns. Look at how work has changed. In many industries, performance is measured in metrics that are constantly tracked, compared, and optimized. Productivity tools monitor output. Algorithms suggest what to focus on next. Decisions that were once made through experience or intuition are increasingly guided by data. The goal is simple: reduce inefficiency. At the same time, attention itself has become a resource. Platforms are designed to maximize engagement, not necessarily understanding. The more time you spend interacting, the more valuable you become to the system. This is not hidden. It is built into the design. You can also see it in financial behavior. Debt cycles have become normalized. People are encouraged to consume now and optimize repayment over time. The system does not collapse because of this. It adapts and continues as long as the flow remains stable. None of these patterns require a shared belief system to function. They only require participation, and that is what makes them powerful. Imagine a young professional starting their career in a large city. They work hard, follow the expected path, and make decisions that seem rational. They choose a stable job, take on manageable debt, and focus on improving their skills. On the surface, everything looks aligned with success. But over time, something begins to shift. Their work becomes increasingly measured by performance metrics they don't fully control. Their schedule is shaped by deadlines and optimization targets rather than personal priorities. Promotions depend not only on effort, but on how well they fit into a system that rewards efficiency over individuality. At the same time, their financial decisions start to reflect the structure around them. They take on a loan to maintain a certain standard of living. They justify it as an investment in their future. And in many ways it is. But it also ties them more closely to a system that requires consistent output to sustain itself. Now consider a different scenario. A middle-class worker in an industry undergoing automation. For years, their role was stable and predictable. But as technology improves, parts of their work are replaced or streamlined. The company becomes more efficient, but their position becomes less secure. They are told to adapt, to learn new skills, to stay competitive, and they try. But the pace of change is not entirely in their control. The system moves faster than any individual can fully anticipate. In both cases, the individuals are not making irrational choices. They are responding logically to the structure they are in, and yet the outcome feels increasingly uncertain. Because the system they are navigating is no longer built around stability. It is built around continuous optimization. When you step back from these individual experiences, a larger pattern begins to emerge. What feels like personal instability is often the result of systemic design. The same mechanisms that drive efficiency at scale also introduce volatility at the individual level. When systems are optimized for speed, flexibility, and output, they naturally become less predictable for the people inside them. Stability becomes a secondary outcome, not a primary goal. This doesn't stay contained within work or finance. It expands into society. Economic decisions are made based on global competitiveness rather than local impact. Industries shift across borders in search of lower costs and higher efficiency. Entire communities can rise or decline depending on how well they fit into these larger systems. From a system perspective, this is rational. From a human perspective, it can feel abrupt and disorienting. At the same time, the flow of information accelerates everything. News cycles compress, opinions form faster, reactions become immediate. Algorithms prioritize engagement, which often means amplifying content that triggers strong responses. Over time, this creates environments where perception shifts rapidly and consensus becomes harder to maintain. As a result, society becomes more fragmented, not necessarily because people disagree more, but because they are responding to different versions of reality shaped by the systems they interact with. This is where the tension becomes clear. We are living in systems that are more advanced, more connected, and more efficient than ever before. And yet, many people feel less certain, less stable, and less in control, because the system is not designed to make individuals feel secure. It is designed to keep functioning. At this point, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The systems we live in are not failing in the traditional sense. They are doing exactly what they were designed to do. They are optimizing. But optimization comes with a trade-off. A system that is built purely around efficiency will always prioritize output over meaning, performance over stability, and results over human experience. It does not ask whether something feels right. It asks whether something works. This is where the real tension lies. Because human beings do not operate purely on efficiency. We need structure, but we also need purpose. We need growth, but we also need a sense of direction that goes beyond constant adaptation. When those elements are missing, even a highly functional system can start to feel empty from the inside. You can think of it this way. Ideology once acted like a skeleton. It provided shape, direction, and a shared understanding of why things mattered. It was often rigid, sometimes flawed, but it gave people a sense of orientation. Optimization, on the other hand, acts like muscle. It enables movement, flexibility, and performance. It allows systems to adapt quickly and respond to change. But muscle without structure becomes chaotic, and structure without movement becomes stagnant. The world has spent the last few decades strengthening the muscle, and in the process, it has quietly weakened the skeleton. So the question is not whether this system is good or bad. It is whether you understand how it operates. Because once you see that most of what surrounds you is driven by optimization, certain things start to make more sense. Why stability feels temporary. Why progress often comes with pressure. Why decisions that seem logical in the moment can still lead to long-term uncertainty. This awareness does not give you control over the system, but it changes how you move within it. Instead of assuming that everything is aligned with your well-being, you begin to recognize that many structures are neutral, designed to function, not to protect. And once you recognize that, you stop expecting clarity from systems that were never built to provide it. You start asking different questions. Not just, how do I succeed here? But, what is this system actually optimizing for? If the world is no longer guided by what it believes, but by what it can optimize, then the rules have already changed, whether we notice it or not. You can follow those rules, adapt to them, and become highly efficient within the system. Or you can step back and question what that efficiency is costing you. Because in a world that rewards performance above all else, the most dangerous thing is not failure. It is becoming so well adjusted to the system that you stop asking who it was built for in the first place. And once you stop asking that question, are you still making choices or just executing them?